said, we kind of use this day to kind of lead us into what's referred to as Holy Week this time every year, the week that is traditionally and historically been approached by the church as a time when we remember the last week of Jesus on the earth before his death and his resurrection. It's interesting, if you read the Gospels, of all the weeks that Jesus spent on the earth in his 30-some-odd years here, the most attention is given to this week and the events leading up to the important work that he performed on the cross and in his resurrection during this week. And so it's an important week. Well, what we typically try to do each year is we try to pick an image that we can use that will kind of serve as a little bit of a backdrop for us for today. And through the Holy Week booklet, we'll be passing out a Holy Week booklet at the end of our service today, and then we'll use this image again next week for our Easter service. Just to make sure everybody's aware, this is a what? Some of you didn't answer, which is a little concerning. We'll try it again. So this is a what? Okay, all right, good. All right, this is a ladder. So we'll get to why we have a ladder in the middle of our sanctuary. Just to probably hopefully state the obvious, this is not a ladder for climbing, so please don't try to climb it. So we'll use that image this week and next week. Kind of the theme for this week and next week, and also will be the kind of a backdrop of the theme for our Holy Week booklet, is this idea of conversations with Christ. Conversations with Christ. What we'll do today and next Sunday for Easter and for each of the days in our Holy Week booklet is we will focus on a different conversation that we see Jesus have during his earthly life and ministry. To me, it is fascinating that God, in all of his infinite power and wisdom and rule over the earth, became a man. He took on humanity. God the Father revealed himself through his Son, who is both fully God and fully man. So much so that we have face-to-face conversations that he had with people recorded for us in the Scriptures. God came and he lived life as a human being and he talked to people. He had regular conversations with people. I mean, how much more human does it get? We are all having conversations every single week, and Jesus comes and he has conversations with people. He is still available to have conversations with today, by the way, for he did not stay dead when he died, but he is now alive. He can still be talked to. The Scriptures tell us that he intercedes on our behalf before the Father. And so this idea of conversations with Jesus is a pretty fascinating one. The conversation that we're going to focus on today comes from John chapter 1. It's a really interesting conversation. It's a conversation that Jesus has very early on in his ministry with a couple of his disciples that he is recruiting to follow him, Philip and Nathaniel. And they have a very fascinating conversation that's going to help us kind of dive into today. So we're going to read just a couple of verses from this first section here. In John chapter 1, read verses 43 to 45. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." So we're told here that Jesus is in Galilee. He's about to go to Galilee. He's just been baptized. In the verses before this, we see him in the Jordan River. He's baptized by John the Baptist, and this is kind of his official beginning into his ministry. And so he goes from there into the region of Galilee. So actually, I'm going to pull up a map for us today. I think we can kind of see this. Just to get a little bit of our bearings here, you see the Jordan River down here. This is where Jesus would have been baptized by John, somewhere around here. And now he goes up to Galilee. We find Philip. He recruits Philip. Philip is from Bethsaida. We learn from another one of the Gospels that Jesus at this time moves to Capernaum. And so he's probably living and operating out of Capernaum. Jesus grows up over here in Nazareth. So this is where Jesus, and we see Nazareth referenced here, right? He's Jesus of Nazareth. And so that gives us a little bit of our bearings. You see, there's a lot of little towns around the Sea of Galilee. A lot of these probably would have been just very small kind of fishing villages. And so this is the setting that they are in. And we can go ahead and take that off now. And so Jesus recruits Philip. And so Philip begins to follow him. He's already recruited Andrew and Peter. They're following him at this point. And at this point, Philip decides that he's going to go and recruit Nathanael. And so he goes and tells Nathanael, he says, "We have found the one whom the Scriptures teach us about." So if we look in the Old Testament, we see that God gives these promises that one day he's going to send a Messiah. He's going to send a great prophet, one who represents him, one who is going to be a great ruler of his people. And so Philip seemingly has believed that this is who Jesus is. Now, we don't really know how Philip has arrived at this conclusion at this point. Maybe he was present at Jesus' baptism when the heavens opened and the Lord spoke about who Jesus was. We don't really know how he's gotten to that conclusion. But to some degree, he has put his faith in Jesus as the one, the promised one, whom God was going to send. And so when he goes and tells this to Nathanael, he says, "Hey, we have found the one who Moses wrote about, who the prophets wrote about, and I want you to come and I want you to see him." Now, there's also some kind of interesting tension here in the way that Philip communicates to Nathanael, because he also references Jesus as this regular, plain old guy from Nazareth. Not a lot going on in Nazareth. Nothing really special about Nazareth. In fact, Philip references him as he's just the son of Joseph. Just a regular guy. Perhaps Nathanael would have even been familiar with the family of Joseph. And so there's this tension here in Philip. On the one hand, he recognizes that Jesus certainly looks and sounds like the promised one that God is going to send, but he's also just this regular guy who's kind of from this obscure background. I really like that about Philip. That he is putting his faith in Jesus as good as he knows how to, even though he's not doing it perfectly. He doesn't understand yet the fullness and the big picture of what is about to happen here. But that doesn't negate who Jesus is. That doesn't take away from who Jesus is. Jesus is who he is. He is God's chosen one, the one whom he promised to send. You know, the reality is, you and I all relate to Jesus imperfectly, just like Philip did. You know, we even have the Scriptures that tell us all about who Jesus is, and we have it laid out, all these things that we can understand about Jesus. But our faith in him is not always perfect, is it? We are faithless, and a lot of times when Jesus is faithful. When Jesus wants us to trust him, sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. That's part of us being human, right? But our faithlessness at times doesn't change who Jesus is. Doesn't change his desire for us to know him and to rest in him and to experience his peace and his forgiveness and his grace and his mercy in our lives. And so what we see here is that God sends Jesus to really be the center point, the hero of this story that God has been writing all throughout the Scriptures. And what Jesus is doing is he is inviting regular people like Philip and Nathanael and me and you to be a part of that story. Even though we're not going to be perfect in it. Even though we're not always going to follow as faithfully as we would like to. But the focus here is on Jesus, the one whom God promised to send, and the one in whom we worship this morning. So we're going to stand together, and we're going to sing to the Lord. Go ahead and stand. Yes, go ahead and stand. And we're going to praise Jesus for who he is this morning.
You may be seated.
All right, so we've seen kind of the beginning of this conversation between Jesus and Philip, and now Philip goes to get Nathanael. And it's when Philip goes to get Nathanael that this conversation begins to get a little interesting. So let's read here from verses 46 to 49. Nathanael says to Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Which is supposed to be funny. Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Which is also supposed to be funny. Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." And Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Which is also a little funny. You people are lagging a little bit this morning. Philip goes and tells Nathanael that he's found the one whom God promised to send, and references the fact that he's from Nazareth. And Nathanael immediately exhibits some skepticism. He says, "Nazareth? I mean, this is like something good coming out of Auburn, right? I mean, that's the sentiment here. Like, surely nothing can good come out of there." There's probably a couple of things perhaps going on in Nathanael's mind here. One is that probably there is some rivalry. You saw on the map, there's a lot of these kind of towns and villages in this region of Galilee, and just like we have rivalries between towns or teams or whatever in our day and age, there probably would have existed this similar sort of thing in that region. And so Nathanael says, what can really good come out of Nazareth? There may be something else working in Nathanael's mind as well, that perhaps he, like perhaps many of the Jews in that day, would have been familiar with some prophecies that had been made about this one person that God was going to send, this prophet, this Messiah. And one of those prophecies is about where this person would come from or where he would be born, and that was in the city of Bethlehem. Now we know, because we have the scriptures now, that this is indeed where Jesus was born. We read this story around Christmas time a lot, right? And so Mary and Joseph are in Bethlehem, right outside of Jerusalem, for this census. They eventually have to flee Bethlehem because Herod the Great tries to kill Jesus, and so they go live in Egypt for a while, and finally, after Herod's dead, they move back up to this part of the world, but they settle in Nazareth. Now, Nathanael didn't know all that, right? So he just hears Nazareth, and he's like, that doesn't have anything to do with any of the prophecies about the Messiah, so how can that be of any kind of significance? Philip doesn't try to explain anything to him. He just says, just come see, just come see. And so they're walking up to Jesus, and Jesus has this fascinating greeting. It almost sounds like he's messing with Nathanael a little bit. "Behold, now here is a real Israelite, one in whom there is no deceit." Now, we don't exactly know what all Jesus was trying to do or communicate in that statement. We do know this, that based on Nathanael's response, he gets Nathanael's attention, doesn't he? He catches Nathanael off guard. Nathanael knows, based on this greeting from Jesus, that Jesus knows some things about him that just your regular average person wouldn't know. And then Jesus goes on and he references this setting where somehow, somewhere along the line, he had seen Nathanael sitting under a fig tree. That's not recorded in Scripture. We don't exactly know what Jesus is referencing there. But this kind of seals the deal in Nathanael's mind, that Jesus is even aware of when he was sitting under a fig tree, apparently at some point. And so he here goes from being this skeptic to, now, Jesus, you're the Son of God. You're the King of Israel. I mean, he goes from way over here on the spectrum to way over here on the spectrum. He to some degree, display some faith here in who Jesus is. One of the other things that's going on in the way that Jesus greets Nathanael is that there seems like on some level Jesus is commending him. Behold, here's one in whom there is no deceit. And despite whatever it is we may think about Nathanael, we do have to give him some props here. That he's willing to come to Jesus with all of his skepticism about who Jesus is. He's not really pulling any punches. He's not really hiding any doubt, any wrestling that he has about how he's going to approach Jesus. And Jesus seems to commend him for this. One of the things he seems to like about Nathanael is that Nathanael is just willing to present himself to Jesus, as we might say, warts and all. And my question would be for us this morning, do you and I do that? Are we willing to come to Jesus, warts and all? Or do we feel like a lot of times we have to clean ourselves up before we come to Jesus? Do we feel like Jesus couldn't really handle it if I was totally honest with him about where I might be at in my heart? It may be that I have some doubt about who Jesus is. It may be that I have some past disappointment when I wanted Jesus to come through in a particular way and at a particular time, and he didn't. And so now I'm a little gun shy, and I'm really hesitant to come in and be genuine and authentic before him. Perhaps there's some past pain and hurt and brokenness in my life that I just can't seem to get past. And it's causing me to distance myself from Jesus. Maybe there is shame that I'm choosing to stay in the muck of. And I'm unwilling to come before Jesus thinking surely he wouldn't accept me for something I've done in the past. Maybe I have this idea of myself where I'm trying to earn my way into favor before Jesus, and I just can't ever do it quite good enough. And so I feel like I'm always falling short. Maybe I'm just distracted. Not by horrible, heinous things, but just by all the little glittering things of the world. And so whenever I come before Jesus, I'm coming before him in a half-hearted way rather than a wholehearted way. Maybe when I come before him, I try to just put on a good face. I try to just pretend like everything's okay when really it's not. And so then this actually moves outward into how I present myself to others as well. I just kind of pretend like everything's okay all the time. There are a number of different things that can keep us from coming before Christ in the way that Nathanael came before Christ. But what we see here is that the heart of Christ for every single one of us is for us to come to him right where we're at. This is true of the person who perhaps has never come to a place where they've put their faith in Christ. And they can find a lot of reasons that are out there that they feel like don't add up for them to be able to just come and confess their need for Christ and their separation from him by their sin and what he performed by his sacrificial death on their behalf. But it's also true of those of us who have walked with Christ for a long time, that there can be things that we encounter in our path with him that perhaps can bring disappointment into our faith, and so we distance ourselves from Christ. We all go through this. And so what this brings us to is it brings us to a time of confession where we learn to practice and cultivate simply being honest and genuine before the Lord in where we're at. If you look at your worship guide, we put those in your seats this morning because we wanted to make sure that each person had one. And generally where there would be the sermon outline on the inside, you see some questions. We've called them confession questions. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to enter into a time of confession. Don't start on those now. I know, sorry, I kind of Sorry, I kind of unleashed the. Just hold off for just 1 second. What we're going to do is we're going to sing for a couple of minutes and just enter into a time of confession. And then after we've sung for a couple of minutes, we're going to have several minutes with just some background music. And during that time, where it's going to be silent, I just want to invite you to kind of work through those questions. Pray through them, meditate on them, think through them. If you want to write through them, you can. There's some space there to do that. And then after we've given everybody several minutes to kind of do that, then we'll sing one more song of confession. But use this time to really search your heart and to identify where am I exactly before the Lord right now, and are there things in my life that are keeping me from feeling I can fully be genuine and authentic before Him. So we'll sing together, and then we'll move through these questions together.
As we finish up those questions, let's sing Lord Have Mercy once more time.
Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy on me. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy on me.
You can remain seated as we continue to sing and put our focus on Jesus. We are not what we should be. We haven't sought what we should see. We've seen your glory, Lord, but looked away. Our hearts are bent, our eyes are dim. Our finest works are stained with sin. And emptiness has shadowed all our way. Jesus Christ, shine into our nights, drive our dark away, till your glory fills our eyes. Jesus Christ, shine into our nights, bind us to your cross, and we find life. Still we often go astray. We chase the world, forget your grace. But you have never failed to bring us back. Feel the depths of what you've done, the death you've died, the victory won. You made a way for us to know your love. Jesus Christ, shine into
As we've just come through a time of confession, it sets us up for the final part of this conversation that we have here in John chapter 1. We have hopefully all kind of recognized in going through this time of confession that we all have places of brokenness. We all have things within us that can separate us from the Lord or create distance between us and the Lord. And so how is it that the Lord can meet us in these places? What assurance do we have that Christ can come into these places and bring healing and bring restoration? Verses 50 and 51 tell us this. Jesus answered Nathanael, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." I picture Jesus chuckling a little bit here. He gives one little insight into Nathanael's life, and Nathanael goes from being a skeptic to being one who declares him as the Son of God. And Jesus says to him, "You ain't seen nothing yet, Nathanael. You have no idea what's about to come down the pipe." And then, as a little bit of a segue or anticipation for what it is that's about to come, Jesus provides this statement that is laced with Old Testament imagery and language. He doesn't just create this statement out of thin air. He brings it out of a story that God has been writing for thousands of years by this point. One of the ways he does that is he references himself as the Son of Man. We'll get to that in a second. Then he also uses this interesting phrase here about seeing the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending. What is up with that? What Jesus is referencing is a story back from Genesis. A story that takes place with a guy named Jacob in Genesis chapter 28. Jacob, at the point of the story where we find him in Genesis 28, is not really that great of a guy. He has just deceived his brother out of his birthright, so much so that his brother is ready to kill him. And Jacob's having to run away. And as he's running away, he's alone and he's out in the middle of the desert by himself. And one night, in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 17, this happens. Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. And taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head like a pillow. And he lay down in that place to sleep. None of you are laughing at any of the funny scriptures. I don't understand this. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Hopefully that sounds familiar. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to west, east, north, and south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." And then Jacob awoke from his sleep, and he said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." And he was afraid and said, "How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven." Jacob has this vision as he's sleeping on this rock. And in the vision, the heavens open and a ladder descends down from the heavens to the earth. And there are angels going up and down the ladder from heaven to earth and back up again. And at the top of the ladder, up in the ceiling tiles, there's God And God is speaking to Jacob there. And he's saying to Jacob, Jacob, you're on the run right now. There are places within you that are broken, but I'm going to meet you in those places. I'm going to restore you in those places. I'm going to bring healing in those places because I'm a God who is faithful. And I will commit to the promises that I made to your father Isaac and to your grandfather Abraham. And in keeping those promises, I will bring protection to you and I will bring provision to you. And in this place, in the desert, Jacob experiences this access point to God. And he wakes up and he worships as a response. He, very similar to Nathanael, puts faith in the Lord. And Jesus, sly dog that he is, references this vision in John chapter 1. And he says, I am now the ladder. I am the one who the heavens have opened and I have come down to the earth, and I am now the access point to God. It's no longer a place like it was for Jacob. It's a person. We have access to God through a person, God the Son, Jesus Christ. But how is it that Jesus goes about fulfilling, becoming this access point to God for you and I? It's by being what he calls himself, the Son of Man. The Son of Man is an Old Testament phrase. It's one that's used in the book of Daniel to denote one who has divine power and divine sovereignty and divine rule over the earth. He is one who stands above the universe in power and in rule. But interestingly, in the Gospel of John, when the Son of Man is used, it's used 10 or 12 times in the Gospel of John. It is often used in connection to the crucifixion of Christ. Which means that the way that Jesus is going to ascend back to his place of universal power and rule is through suffering. This is what Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 2. It says that God the Son came and humbled himself as a man to the point of death so that he might be raised up to be called the Lord of heaven and earth, so that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess before him that he is indeed the Son of Man, the ruler of all heaven and earth, because he has gone through suffering on our behalf. The reason that Jesus can meet us in our places of sin and brokenness, meet us in our skepticism and in our doubt and in our failure and in our disappointment, is because he went to the cross and he took all of those things upon himself. And when he died on the cross, all of those things died with him. And when you and I are willing to come to him and confess that we need him as our Savior to be rescued from sin, then we join with him in his death, and we're united to him in his death, so that those things die off in us too. And it doesn't mean that we get free of them in this life. It doesn't mean that we walk perfectly with him in this life, but it means that we have his work and his finished work on our behalf as a point of assurance in all the places of brokenness that you and I experience along the path of following him. And so we're brought to the cross. We come to the cross, and we remember that at the cross, Jesus completed his work of defeating sin and death in our lives. That for all those who come and confess their need for Christ, that he meets them in that place of brokenness and brings healing and restoration and peace and forgiveness and love and grace and mercy. And so we come today where we remember the cross. Jesus actually gave us a specific thing to do to remember the cross. He instituted it at his last meal with his followers before he went to be crucified, where he took bread and he said, "This bread is representative of my body, which is broken for you for the forgiveness of sins, and this cup is representative of my blood that was shed for you in the forgiveness of sins." The Lord's Supper, communion. And so what we're going to do today is here in a minute we're going to take communion. Before we do that, we're going to sing a couple of songs that remind us of Christ's death on our behalf. After we've sung those songs, you may notice at the perimeter of the room there's some tables set up. They have bread and the cup on them. By the way, if you're a gluten-free person, we have gluten-free bread. That may be the most exciting thing you've heard today, right? And so after we're done singing, we'll have some background music that plays for a little bit. You can go to the tables, you can get the bread, and you can get the cup, and then return to your seat and take the elements at your seat. We would ask, there's some special cups that we have. These are not souvenirs. We need them and use them over and over again. So when you leave, there'll be baskets at the doors. You can place your cup in a basket as you leave. Please don't take it home with you. And so for those of us whose faith is in Christ, even if you're visiting with us today, we invite you to come to the cross today and receive what Christ has done on our behalf, so that he might meet us in our doubts and meet us in our brokenness and meet us in our hurts and our discouragements and our disappointments, our sin that separates us from him. If you're here today and you've never placed your faith in Christ, I would encourage you to do so today. Paul says today is the day of salvation. Jesus welcomes you just like he welcomed Nathanael. And so today I would place Christ before you and what he has done on your behalf, so that you might receive him and be reconciled to God, receiving forgiveness through the death of Christ and new life through his resurrection. We'll sing, and then we will